Imagine stepping into a cold stone chamber lit only by flickering torches. The air is heavy with smoke and sweat. The walls echo with whispers. Before you stands a massive wooden frame, ropes and iron pulleys gleaming in the dim light. It looks less like furniture and more like something from a nightmare. This is the rack, one of the most infamous devices of the Middle Ages. The rack was terrifyingly simple. A wooden frame as long as a man with rollers at each end. The victim's wrists were tied to one end, the ankles to the other. A crank turned slowly, pulling the body tighter and tighter, stretching joints to their limits. Bones did not always break, but the sound of ligaments straining, the sheer terror of waiting for the next turn of the wheel, was enough to destroy anyone's resolve. But here's the truth. The rack wasn't used everywhere, and not as often as people think. In many cases, its fame was more powerful than its actual use. Just the sight of it in the corner of a courtroom or a dungeon was enough to make the accused confess before a hand touched the crank. Fear itself was the real weapon, and the Middle Ages were full of these weapons of fear. Not every device was designed to draw blood. Many were built to humiliate, to frighten, to remind everyone watching that authority was absolute. One of the most common wasn't even hidden in dungeons. It stood proudly in town squares. The pillory, or as some call it, the shame post. Imagine a wooden frame with holes for the head and hands. A person would be locked in it, standing helpless in the middle of the marketplace. For hours, sometimes for days, they remained on display as neighbors threw rotten vegetables, mud, or worse. The pain wasn't just physical, it was humiliation, the destruction of reputation. In medieval society, being shamed could be a punishment worse than chains. Public punishments like the pillory reveal something important. Medieval torture was not only about pain, it was about control. It was theater, a performance meant to terrify the crowd as much as the victim. When a thief or liar was locked into the pillory, the entire town learned a lesson. Step out of line and you could be next. Even simple devices carried enormous psychological weight. Take the stocks, a cousin of the pillory. They held the legs instead of the arms, leaving victims seated in uncomfortable positions, sometimes for days. Children mocked them, animals wandered by, whether punished them with sun or rain. It was cruelty by exposure, not by blades. And yet, to the people watching, it felt like justice. The contrast is striking. While the rack whispered horror in the darkness of dungeons, the pillory shouted humiliation in broad daylight. Together they show us how medieval justice worked. Pain in secret, shame in public, fear in every corner. And this is just the beginning. The Middle Ages were a laboratory of imagination, where fear was forged into iron, and authority built devices stranger than nightmares. Some of these machines look absurd to us now. Others still send shivers down the spine. And the deeper we step into this dark world, the stranger the inventions become. The rack and the pillory showed two sides of medieval punishment. Terror in the shadows and shame in the daylight. But not all devices stayed hidden in dungeons or sat in town squares. Some blended both pain and spectacle, turning suffering into theater for entire communities. Take the iron chair, for example. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary throne, a heavy seat made of iron with high back and sturdy legs. But a closer look revealed hundreds of sharp spikes covering the surface. On the seat, the back, the armrests, even the footrest. When a victim was forced to sit down, the weight of their body pressed them into those spikes. Chains or straps held them in place, making escape impossible. The iron chair was not always about death. In many cases, it was about fear. Imagine being dragged into a courtroom and shown the chair. To sit on it, even briefly, left wounds that could take weeks to heal. The victim knew that every movement only made things worse. Sometimes fires were lit beneath the chair, heating the metal until it burned as well as pierced. For spectators, it was a powerful lesson. Disobedience led not only to pain, but to public humiliation. Then there were devices designed to look small and harmless, but capable of delivering extraordinary suffering. One of the most infamous was the thumbscrew. A simple tool, two flat pieces of iron connected by screws. The victim placed their fingers or thumbs inside, and the screw was turned slowly, pressing down until bone and flesh compressed. Unlike the iron chair, the thumbscrew was portable, could be carried anywhere, into prisons, battlefields, even Inquisitors' chambers. Its very simplicity made it terrifying. Everyone had thumbs. Everyone could imagine the pain. The thumbscrew had variations, two larger ones for hands, smaller ones for toes. In some cases, whole families were shown the device, knowing one wrong word could put their children inside it. Fear traveled faster than the device itself. People whispered about it in markets, and the idea of its pressure alone was often enough to force confessions. But medieval Europe did not rely on machines alone. Torture was also a public ritual, a performance staged for the crowd. Town squares filled not just with merchants and buyers but with punishment. A thief tied to a whipping post, a liar forced into the stocks, a suspected traitor displayed in an iron collar. For the community it was more than justice, it was entertainment. Chroniclers from the 14th and 15th centuries describe people gathering eagerly for executions and punishments, treating them like festivals. Children climbed onto carts for a better view, vendors sold food, musicians sometimes played. Pain was turned into spectacle. The idea was simple. One person's suffering taught everyone else a lesson. And yet, not all punishments were equal. Nobles and wealthy merchants often avoided the most humiliating devices. The pillory and the stocks were usually reserved for commoners. The iron chair and thumbscrew were for those accused of serious crimes or heresy. In this way, even torture reflected the deep divisions of medieval society. Still, the devices had one thing in common: they terrified by design. The iron chair was covered in spikes not only to hurt, but to look terrifying. The thumbscrew was shown before it was used, giving the accused time to imagine the slow turning of the screw. Public punishments worked the same way. The shame was often worse than the physical pain. This reveals a truth about the Middle Ages. Punishment was not only about inflicting harm, it was about creating fear in the mind. The sight of spikes, the turning of a screw, the sound of chains rattling, the silence of a crowd waiting. All of it was theater. And in this theater, pain was not hidden but displayed, exaggerated, and remembered. But as strange as these devices seem, they were only the beginning. The Middle Ages produced tools that were not just cruel, but absurd, machines so bizarre that they looked more like props from nightmares than real instruments of justice. And yet, they were very real, built to silence voices and frighten entire towns. The Middle Ages were not only an age of brutality, they were also an age of imagination. And sometimes that imagination produced devices so bizarre, so absurd, that they seemed to belong more to nightmares than to reality. These machines didn't always draw blood. Many were designed simply to terrify, to humiliate, or to silence those who stepped outside the rules of society. One of the strangest examples was the heretic's fork. Despite the name, it wasn't really a fork, it was a metal rod, often with sharp prongs at both ends. It was strapped between the chin and the chest, or sometimes between the chin and the collarbone, forcing the victim's head upward. The idea was cruelly simple. The person could not lower their head, could not sleep, could not even rest without stabbing themselves. Imagine being forced to stand for hours, eyes burning, body trembling, terrified of dozing off because the moment you did, the prongs would pierce your skin. It was a punishment designed not to kill, but to exhaust, to break the will through sheer discomfort and fear. Another device targeted not heretics, but those considered disruptive in society, especially women accused of gossip or defiance. This was the scold's bridle, also known as the brank. It looked like an iron mask or cage placed over the head, with a flat piece of iron inserted into the mouth. Sometimes it pressed down on the tongue, making speech impossible. The woman was forced to wear it in public, paraded through the streets while neighbors jeered. The scold's bridle was less about physical pain and more about humiliation. In medieval towns, reputation was everything. To be seen in this mask meant being branded as a troublemaker, a liar, or worse. In some regions of England and Scotland, records describe women marched through markets wearing the bridle while bells attached to it rang with every step, ensuring everyone noticed. It was punishment through spectacle, where shame cut deeper than iron. And yet, These devices reveal something important about medieval culture. They weren't just punishing crimes. They were punishing behaviors that threatened social order. The heretic's fork was aimed at dissenters, people accused of speaking against the church. The scold's bridle silenced voices, especially women's voices, that challenged authority or disrupted the peace. In both cases, fear of humiliation was often enough to keep others silent. Historians debate how often some of these devices were actually used. Surviving examples exist in museums, but written records suggest that in many cases, the threat of their use was enough. The Middle Ages loved symbols, and nothing symbolized silence and obedience more clearly than a heavy iron mask locked onto someone's face. Some devices blurred the line between punishment and theater. Imagine the sight of a woman in a bridle, iron cage around her head, walking slowly through a crowded street as people pointed and laughed, or a heretic standing rigid, unable to move his neck, his eyes wide open as priests preached against him. These punishments weren't hidden away. They were staged, performed for audiences hungry for spectacle. What's fascinating is that many of these devices were designed to be uncomfortable, not necessarily lethal. They rarely killed. Instead, they drained people, destroyed reputations, and carved fear into the minds of everyone watching. Pain fades, but humiliation lingers. The heretic's fork and the scold's bridle are reminders that medieval justice was not only about chains and dungeons. It was also about control. Control over speech, control over belief, control over reputation. And in many cases, control was achieved not through blood, but through fear of being shamed in front of your entire community. But these were not the only strange inventions of the age. Some devices carried even more power because they were linked to religion itself. They were not just punishments, they were acts of salvation, or at least that's how the authorities justified them. And in the name of faith, some of the most infamous torture devices in history were born. By the late Middle Ages, torture was no longer just about crime or gossip. It became tied to something far more powerful, faith. When the church grew into the most influential institution of medieval Europe, it also became a judge. And to justify its punishments, it often claimed they were not cruelty, but salvation. The Inquisition is the most famous example. Created in the 13th century and spreading in the centuries after, its purpose was to root out heresy, any belief or action that challenged the church. And to do this, Inquisitors used the full arsenal of medieval fear. Torture was not always constant or universal, but when it appeared, it was given a holy mask. Pain was reframed as a tool to save the soul. One of the most infamous devices tied to this era was the rack. We have already seen how it stretched the body, tearing at joints and sinews. But in inquisitorial courts, it was more than just a tool of pain. It was a way to extract confessions of heresy. To the authorities, forcing someone to confess was a way of cleansing lies and restoring order, no matter how that confession was obtained. Another device often associated with the Inquisition, though historians debate its true use, is the Iron Maiden. This tall, coffin-like cabinet was lined with sharp metal spikes on the inside. A victim placed within would be trapped standing upright, the heavy door closed around them. But here's the twist. Many historians believe the Iron Maiden was more myth than reality. Actual medieval sources are scarce. The earliest reliable references appear centuries later, in the 18th and 19th centuries, when writers wanted to paint the Middle Ages as uniquely cruel. So was the Iron Maiden ever truly used? Probably not in the way we imagine today. But its legend shows us something important. The very idea of such a device reflected how people thought about faith and fear. The myth itself was powerful enough to survive, because it symbolized the extremes of authority in the name of religion. Other religiously framed devices were far simpler but equally terrifying. Consider the Spanish chair, similar to the iron chair, but heated with fire beneath it, said to purify the body. Or the strappado, where a person's hands were tied behind their back and they were hoisted into the air by a rope, then dropped suddenly to wrench the shoulders. Inquisitors claimed these methods forced truth into the open, but in reality, they broke bodies and spirits alike. What's chilling is not just the tools themselves, but the reasoning behind them. Pain was justified as an act of mercy. Better to suffer in this life, they said, than burn eternally in the next. The paradox was haunting. To save a soul, one had to destroy the body. And people believed it. The sight of an inquisitorial chamber, candles, crucifixes, instruments of pain neatly arranged, was enough to terrify entire towns. Whether or not every device was used, the image of the church sanctioning torture gave it unimaginable power. Few dared to question it. Fear of both earthly pain and eternal damnation silenced even the boldest critics. The truth is, torture under religion was not always about truth at all. It was about obedience. Heresy was dangerous not only because of theology, but because it threatened the unity of society. The church needed control, and torture was one of its sharpest tools. But as time went on, the reality of torture shifted again. By the late Middle Ages, many of these devices became more symbolic than practical. They stood as warnings, displayed as instruments of order, even when they were rarely used. And yet, their legends grew larger with every century, shaping how we remember the medieval world today. The devices tied to faith remind us of a hard truth. In the Middle Ages, power and religion walked hand in hand. And when fear was wrapped in holiness, it became almost impossible to resist. But torture was not only about God. It was also about kings, nobles, and the control of society itself. Beyond the chambers of the Inquisition, these devices shaped politics, culture, and even how people thought about justice. And the legacy they left behind was darker than iron and deeper than stone. By now, it's clear that medieval torture was more than just iron and wood. It was an entire system built on fear, fear of authority, fear of shame, fear of God. And in many ways, the legacy of these devices tells us more about the society that created them than about the pain they inflicted. Take the rack or the iron chair. Were they used every day in every city? Not at all. In fact, records suggest that their use was far rarer than the legends claim. But their presence in the imagination of the people was constant. A whisper that the rack is waiting could silence dissent more effectively than 1,000 guards. The devices did not have to be used on everyone. They only had to exist, looming in the collective memory, to keep entire populations in line. This is what historians call the psychology of punishment. A single execution or public humiliation could control thousands. The sight of one woman in a scold's bridle walking through the market, or one man locked into the pillory, was enough to remind everyone else of their place. The medieval world valued reputation above almost everything. To lose it in front of your neighbors was a punishment that lasted longer than physical wounds. And that is the true power of these devices. They were not only weapons of flesh, they were weapons of the mind. Fear traveled faster than iron. Word of a heretic stretched on the rack spread across towns and villages, growing more terrifying with each retelling. Myths like the Iron Maiden, even if exaggerated, lived on because they represented something real. The idea that the authorities had no limits. But there's another layer to this legacy. Torture was also political. Kings, nobles, and bishops used it not just to punish crimes, but to display their dominance. A lord who kept an iron chair in his castle didn't need to use it often. Its very presence told his subjects, "I hold your fate." Public punishments in town squares were staged performances, meant to entertain the crowd but also to teach obedience. In a world without newspapers, trials and punishments were news, theater, and propaganda all at once. It's also important to remember that torture was not unique to Europe. Similar devices, or at least similar ideas, appeared in other parts of the world. Ancient China, for example, had its own traditions of public humiliation and inventive punishments. But in Europe, the combination of religion, politics, and public spectacle gave torture a special symbolic weight. It was never just about one person's suffering, it was about society itself. And here's the paradox. Many of the most terrifying devices were rarely, if ever, used. The Iron Maiden is a perfect example. It became famous centuries later, partly because people wanted to believe the Middle Ages were darker than their own time. The device itself may have been a myth, but the fear it represented was very real. In that sense, the Iron Maiden worked without ever being used. Its story alone was enough to cement the reputation of medieval cruelty. This tells us something essential about how fear works. In the medieval world, pain was temporary, but stories were eternal. Tales of torture spread faster than steel, carried by rumors, chroniclers, and later by artists who wanted to paint the past in shadow. That is why, centuries later, we still remember the heretic's fork, the scold's bridle, the rack, the chair. They became symbols of power and the fragility of human freedom. The legacy of these devices shaped more than medieval society. It shaped how we, today, imagine the Middle Ages. We picture dungeons, chains, masks of iron, spiked chairs, and in doing so, we remember not only the cruelty but the fear that bound entire kingdoms together. Whether these devices were used often or rarely, their impact remains undeniable. They remind us that fear is sometimes more powerful than any blade. And so the story of medieval torture is not just about pain. It is about control, spectacle, and imagination. It is about how authority uses symbols to bend society. And it is about how legends of cruelty outlive the iron itself. The Middle Ages are gone, but the shadows of their devices remain, etched in history, whispered in stories, and remembered in nightmares. When we think of the Middle Ages, what images come to mind? Dark dungeons, iron masks, spiked chairs, and cages hanging from castle walls. These images are powerful, but here is the truth. Much of what we picture today is a mixture of reality and myth. The devices existed, but their stories grew larger than life, carried through centuries of fear and imagination. The Iron Maiden is the clearest example. Historians now agree that this coffin of spikes, supposedly used to pierce victims on all sides, was likely never used in the way we imagine. The earliest detailed descriptions of it came long after the Middle Ages, in the 18th and 19th centuries, when writers and collectors wanted to paint medieval Europe as especially cruel. And yet, if you walk into some museums today, you can still see Iron Maidens on display. Were they used? Probably not. But as symbols, they became immortal. The rack, the thumbscrew, the scold's bridle, these were real, but their use was often exaggerated. Chroniclers, artists, and later storytellers amplified their horror to make a point. In some cases, punishment was less about the device itself and more about the idea of it. To hear that a town owned a rack was enough to keep people silent. To see a bridle in the marketplace reminded women to hold their tongues. These devices worked because their memory was sharper than their spikes. Over time, art and literature added fuel to the fire. Renaissance and Enlightenment thinkers used tales of medieval cruelty to contrast their own age of reason. The darker they painted the Middle Ages, the brighter their own time looked. Writers described dungeons filled with instruments of torment, whether or not they had ever seen them. Pain was turned into legend, and legend into a warning. Even today, the myth of medieval torture lives on. Movies, television, and novels love to show iron cages, burning chairs, or shadowy inquisitors. They are visual shorthand for fear, power, and darkness. But behind the myths lies a deeper truth. These devices, whether real or exaggerated, represented something universal. They showed how fragile freedom was, and how authority could shape entire societies through fear alone. What makes this legacy so haunting is not just the cruelty, but the imagination. The Middle Ages created devices that were part weapon, part performance, part story. They were not only built of iron and wood, they were built of fear. And fear is the one material that never rusts. So, when we picture a medieval dungeon, we are not only seeing history. We are seeing centuries of memory, myth, and fascination. We are seeing how people in the past controlled each other, and how we, in the present, still carry those images as symbols of tyranny. In the end, medieval torture reminds us of something simple but chilling. Pain may fade, but stories last forever. The rack may be gone, the bridle may gather dust, and the Iron Maiden may never have been real. But the fear they represented, fear of shame, fear of power, fear of losing control, that fear still echoes, louder than any chain.